What is it about the 50s and the early 60s? Why do we always want to relive those days? Is it because when we look back, life seems so much simpler, or happier, better? Whatever, they sure are doing it here at a bar in Schaumburg, northwest of Chicago. When they built this bar, they put something in the very center of the room, what they see as the symbol of that time. And they even named the place after it. The most nostalgic handle they could think of. Studebaker's. What a name. What a car. What a time. Take 1962, for example. There you are, or some pal of yours, in a Lark convertible. It is heaven. 1962, business was good. Half of all Americans were under the age of 25. Vietnam hadn't heated up yet. John Glenn circled the earth, John Kennedy was president, and Mayor Daley was making Chicago work. And 100 miles east of Chicago in South Bend, Indiana, things seemed to be on a pretty even keel. Darryl LaMonica was there, starring at Notre Dame. It wasn't a particularly great season. They won 5 and lost 5. And across town at Studebaker, they were breaking about even too. The company had almost 1/5 of the independent car business. And to most of the outside world in '62, Studebaker looked pretty good.
Hello. I'm Mr. Ed. A horse is a horse, of course.
They certainly were in the public view, sponsoring a very popular TV show.
Horse is the famous Mr. Ed. Go right to the source.
Studebaker looked solid to many of us, and it should have. The commercials were designed to give us that feeling. It was a very proud company. In 1962, it had been around for 110 years. They had worked hard to build an image of a caring, stylish, happy, alive organization. In 1962, Studebaker made a public relations film. They showed their flamboyant president, Sherwood Egbert, in one of their smart new models. The film showed us what was apparently a strong corporation with lots of divisions. In addition to cars and trucks, Studebaker's other holdings produced floor finishing machines, tractors, plastics, diesel equipment, a popular motor additive. They were even into space technology, and they were the distributor for Mercedes-Benz for all of North America. In this company film, President Egbert was shown as a very confident leader.
We are already testing our 1963 cars on the proving ground track today. Our 1962...
That was 1962.
How many roads must a man walk down?
The very next year, 1963, the bottom fell out. John Kennedy was shot, and then just 3 weeks later, Studebaker went out of the automobile business. For South Bend, it was a terrible 1-2 punch. We weren't looking for lessons back in 1963 because times were pretty good. But the closing in South Bend held an omen for us all. We'll look at that after this message.
We're visiting a typical American housewife, the proud owner of a new Studebaker Lark. Mrs.
Yes?
But you're Zsa Zsa Gabor.
In many ways, things are the same as they've always been in South Bend. Notre Dame still plays on Saturday afternoons in the autumn, and they still seem to be breaking about even. And 20 years after the biggest industry in town died, South Bend still exists, and in fact, it looks pretty good. Downtown is okay. There are still businesses around, and there are still jobs.
Guess there's no use in hanging around.
But there's also a feeling here, a warm spot for something that passed away.
I'll find some crowded avenue.
Welcome you and...
August 1983. Members of the Studebaker Automobile Club have come here from all over. Hundreds of them. People who share one thing in common. They love Studebakers, even though the last one rolled off the line 2 decades ago.
Loving you.
What happened? Why did it all end? Many of the answers are here in a large collection of film recently gathered in South Bend. There is so much of it that it hasn't even been cataloged yet. Hundreds of films, all dealing with Studebaker. There are even some big-budget shows intended for theatrical release, like this one. Produced by Columbia Pictures in 1952 and using some pretty big Hollywood stars, this movie purports to tell the story of how the Studebakers became wagon makers. It started from father to son.
I've had my own shop, and I worked for others. And if I've ever learned anything in life, it's this. It's yours now. Well, I'll see you at supper.
That's how the film presents it, the beginning and the company motto. There's disagreement about that motto, by the way. Some say what the old man really said was, give a little more than you promise. But by and large, the film is factual. Like this scene, for example. It seems that 5 Studebaker brothers wanted to sell their wagons to the Union Army during the Civil War. Since they built their wagons by hand and of the highest quality, they hoped to make a monumental deal for 10 of them. But something happened.
You hear that, John? We got a contract for 10 wagons. 10.
Henry, not 10.
Not 10?
No.
100. 100 wagons. With delivery in 6 months.
The problems seemed insurmountable. Money, manpower, and materials. But they were solved in a typical Hollywood fashion.
If we can't get seasoned wood, we'll make it. There's no such process. Then we'll invent one.
And surprisingly, they did do it. Not only did they make the 100 wagons, but they made them in half the time.
What's the matter, Peter?
The movie story goes on to document a major crisis. It was 1874, 3 years after the Great Chicago Fire.
I thought you might want to keep this.
Oh, thanks, Joe.
Isn't it clear we'll have to close down?
Close down? What else?
Then came these lines. Remember now, this is a company-made film. The message is designed for an audience in 1952.
But what about our men? Most of them have never worked for anyone but us. They helped us to build a tradition of fine craftsmanship. We had sons working at benches beside their fathers.
Studebaker did have that image, a company that cared about its employees, a place where craftsmanship was passed on from father to son.
My father worked there. As soon as they found out my father worked there, I was immediately hired.
Loren Pennington once worked at Studebaker, as did his father and his grandfather. Today, he is a professor at Emporia State University and the foremost authority on Studebaker.
Fathers took pride in having their sons work there, their grandsons, and so forth.
That was certainly the feeling from the 1952 film. It was saturated with paternalism and pride.
What do you think?
It's good. I think the time has come for us to go into the manufacture of gasoline automobiles. Eventually, I'd like to see us make the whole car right here in South Bend. This business was built by turning out wagons that way.
Soon they were being turned out in South Bend under the leadership of this man, A.R. Erskine. They continued building wagons, many for the Army in World War I. But in 1920, they stopped and devoted all their energies to the gas buggy, an all-new Big Six. These are the oldest existing films of Studebaker's, dating back to the late 20s. Looking back, it seems remarkable the things those early cars were able to do. There had been some 5,000 wagon makers in the U.S., but only Studebaker was able to make the transition from horse-drawn to motor vehicle. And from the earliest days, they kept their promise for quality. They tested in South Bend, and they tested at the Daytona Endurance Run, where they always did pretty well. At first, the Depression didn't seem to affect Studebaker. The family had become part of Chicago society. And in 1930, it made $1.5 million with cars called the Commander, the President, and the Dictator. But in 1933, the company was broke.
Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime?
It informed the stockholders that Studebaker had gone into receivership, and 2 months after that, President Erskine put a bullet through his heart.
Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime?
Then, two things happened at once. Officials of the company began to reorganize, and the workers began to organize. There wasn't much company opposition to that. One of the early presidents of the union remembers the Depression well, and how Studebaker still managed to act as a father figure. His name is George Hupp.
At one point, they set up a food store, and people who didn't have, the employees now, who didn't have food, could go down there, and you could get a ham, or you could get meat, and you could get some groceries, and you didn't have the money to pay for it, so you charged it. Everything I have is yours.
At the same time, the company was getting some credit of its own. It borrowed nearly $7 million, and by 1939, was ready to introduce a new, low-priced car. There was a lot of hoopla connected with it. Studebaker even produced a theatrical movie to promote the car. It was about a dynamic magazine editor driving his investigative reporters to work harder to steal the secret of the new car.
Hello. I see that the usual calm and peaceful atmosphere.
Oh, shut up. This is just the sort of thing you love.
You couldn't possibly mean that new car, could you? Not the new car that 8 newsreels are chasing after.
Yes, we need it. We've got to have it.
Well, it's all yours.
You mean that
I mean that the entire story is imperishably inscribed on film.
The audience learns that the car Studebaker secretly produced for that low-price market is the Champion. It was one heck of a car, and in that 1 year, 1939, Studebaker sold 34,000 of them and turned a tidy profit, $3 million. Studebaker was coming out of the woods, putting the Depression behind. Management did a lot of it, but so did the newly formed union, UAW number 5.
I don't think there was a plant in the country where the employees worked harder. And the line started at 7 in the morning, shut off at 12 at noon, and started back up at 1 and shut down at 5. It was whistles. And those were the only times that you stopped work.
Nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you try.
The union did more than that. It used its own money to design ads and to place them in the papers. The management of Studebaker always remembered what the workers had done, and for many years, out of gratitude, gave in easily, often too easily, to the union demands.
If I didn't
The outbreak of World War II helped Studebaker. The company stopped making cars and went into the defense business. It began building aircraft engines in Indiana and Chicago. Through Lend-Lease, Russia got so many of the company's trucks that the word the Russians used for the truck, any truck, became Studebaker. By the end of the war, the company recovered fully from the Depression.
You got to accentuate the positive.
And then came a series of good breaks. They were ahead of the competition and came out with the first new post-war car called the Skyway Champion. People hadn't been able to buy a new car for 4 years, remember, and they were hungry. And they gobbled up the Studebakers. Their designer, Raymond Loewy, the man who conceived the streamlined train and Air Force One, came out with something very radical. People joked about it. They said the front and the back looked so much alike you couldn't tell if the car was coming or going, but they bought it nonetheless. In 1950, the year the front of the car looked like it should have had a propeller, that year they sold 268,000 cars. Great business for an independent. But with prosperity came labor problems. Wages were high, workers were dogging it, and every union demand was met. And by 1952, the profit curve had started down. But it was not a year to mourn.
Send me photographs and souvenirs.
On the contrary, it was the company's 100th year in business, a time to celebrate. Studebaker made a host of sophisticated public relations films for television and theaters, among them one called A Family of Craftsmen. They chose a family of workers to present their old theme. The relationship between these loyal employees and the company was the symbol of the paternal image that Studebaker had fostered over the years.
This automobile, more than any other modern motor car, is the product of craftsmen, of sons and grandsons, of nephews and brothers who, by the thousands, share family traditions and inherited skills.
They chose the Bocon family, and it was a pretty good choice, part of the Studebaker tradition. Pop Bocon had moved to South Bend from Hungary back in the mid-20s and found work at Studebaker, saved his money, bought some land, and began raising a family. By 1952, his children had grown up and joined him at Studebaker. Rudy Bocon worked in body assembly. Brother Bill in final assembly, and Joe Bocon Jr. was in the drafting department. Lillian, like her sisters before her, worked in the office. Most of the Bocon children married fellow employees, and when they settled down to raise their families, they built homes on the land that their father had bought. In this film, Studebaker was eager to show how it had helped people like the Bocons stay close to each other, even when they weren't at work. After all, it was the money that Pop Bocon had earned at Studebaker that paid for the land on which they were living. After work, you'd find Joe Bocon Jr. cultivating his 10-acre nursery behind his father's garden, close enough for his sister Mary to visit on an afternoon stroll. In his backyard, Rudy Bocon raised minks as a hobby. Bill tinkered in a machine shop in his garage, which attracted the attention of his sister Irene's children. Velma's family lived close by, too. And, of course, there were Mom and Pop. Mom always busy around the house, while Pop sometimes snuck off to take a nap. It was a lovely film. It showed the Bocons together and enjoying good times. 1952 was an especially good year for them. Lillian, the baby of the family, married Joe that year, but that didn't stop her from being Miss 1952 in Studebaker's 100th anniversary pageant.
Join in singing our song, Rolling Along for 100 Years.
Rolling along for 100 years, sing of the Studebaker.
The rest of the family joined in. The film was released in 1953, some 30 years ago. We returned to the Bocon homestead recently. The house still stands, and the family, what remains of it, gathered again. And as our story progresses, you will find out what happened to Studebaker, to the auto industry as a whole, and most specifically, to this family of craftsmen. But first, this message.
Greatest team in the world, fathers and sons working side by side to build wear-resisting stamina into every Studebaker.
Don't let the stars get in your eyes, don't let the moon break your heart.
In 1953, Studebaker brought out yet another new car by the noted designer Raymond Loewy. It was touted as the new American car with a European look. Maybe it should have looked more American.
Your Farmer Jones out here in Iowa looks at this thing and says, as many of them did complain, I don't like that radical styling. I want a conservative car. And Studebaker always has this problem.
You mean
1954 wasn't a very good year.
goodbye, ain't that a shame?
Sales dropped again. Then history was made. Studebaker and the UAW negotiated the first wage cut in the American auto industry, 15% across the board. Then another dramatic event occurred.
This week, Philco is proud to salute the joining of Studebaker Corporation
and the Packard Motor Car Company.
Studebaker merged with Packard from Detroit. They announced it on TV programs like this and at a mass rally at Notre Dame Stadium. Packard, the very name had meant prestige, class, and quality. It would be a marvelous merger. Studebaker's lower-cost cars, Packard's luxury models. It couldn't miss. At the time, Cliff McMillan was a corporate vice president in charge of labor relations, a big wig. In fact, he is the highest-ranking member of Studebaker Auto Management still living in South Bend. He is retired now, but he remembers that Packard merger very well.
Didn't work. They were cars sitting all over the place, mostly the Packards.
Even now, 30 years later, McMillan still laughs at the memory of how another executive characterized that deal.
He remarked that the merger between Studebaker and Packard was like two drunks trying to help each other across the road.
The merger was an unmitigated disaster. The Packards were fraught with quality problems, and they were ugly. Also, Packard executives came over from Detroit with ideas about plant discipline. That caused immediate friction and a series of wildcat strikes. Union leader George Hupp.
They said that you were an optimist if you come to work in the morning carrying a lunch bucket, because you're not going to work that long. We had that many shutdowns.
It's big. It's new. It's the big news in the low-price field. The big news Studebaker.
But Studebaker still looked pretty good on our television sets. The ads were slick. By the way, the guy in the hat, that's a young Tom Bosley. He made him look like Happy Days even then.
Ford. Come see the standout car in the low-price field. It's the most exciting.
But they weren't happy, not at Studebaker. In 1956, the year this commercial was made, Studebaker lost $43 million. The worst year ever.
They are on the verge of going into bankruptcy. And the only thing that saves them is the Eisenhower administration decides, as the Carter administration later decided in the case of Chrysler, that we cannot allow the Studebaker Corporation to go under.
Oh, yes, I'm the great pretender.
It wasn't done through guaranteed loans, but it was done with government help. That part of the story is not widely known. Ike didn't want a major corporation going under, not in 1956, not while he was running for a second term. A deal was worked out, therefore, with another large corporation called Curtiss-Wright. Government business was injected. That's when they were given the North American distributorship for Mercedes-Benz, and Studebaker limped along. Then, in 1959, a miracle happened. It was called the Lark. The only other economy car around at the time was the Rambler, and America wanted more compacts. Studebaker saw the opening and went for it. And in 1959, the company made $30 million. It was on a roll again.
But he's got high hopes. He's got
The company came up with some unusual ideas for selling the product, like this one, for example. Arlene Francis substituting for Jack Parr on the old Tonight Show.
They said, we'd like to make you a dress to wear on the show. And this, my dear, is the upholstery from a Lark. How about that for a dress? Look at that lovely soft material, huh?
There were other bizarre ideas for showing off the Lark. One of them was displayed in a parade in 1960 in downtown South Bend. A flocked Lark convertible. That's right, flocked. Like the fuzzy stuff they put on Christmas trees. What's more, some people even bought cars like that.
like glue. Stick because I'm stuck on you.
But the executives in that parade had some new worries.
Hit the road, Jack. Don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more.
Last year, only Studebaker and Rambler were making compacts. This year, 1960, the big three jumped into the market. At least 10 different compacts were competing for buyers, and Lark sales began to slip. Secretly, some of the big guys were desperate. If they could just find a dynamic leader to save them. They found him on the West Coast, Sherwood Egbert.
He came out of the West like Lac Navarre, and he came to South Bend. He hit it like a cyclone.
Egbert took charge. He pushed for big concessions from the union. He wanted to reform some of Studebaker's old liberal labor policies. Lester Fox, the vice president of Local 5 and chief negotiator at that time, advocated a strike.
We were unsure of what their agenda really was, and it almost became a matter of preserving honor.
January 1962. Studebaker took the most spectacular strike in its history. Not the kind of thing Sherwood Egbert lived with very easily, that's for sure. One day, he arrogantly crossed the picket line in his Mercedes-Benz. A near riot resulted, and it took a cadre of police to get him out.
Today, there's a new kind of horsepower from the advanced thinking of Studebaker.
Spring 1962. The strike was settled. As is often the case, no one won very much. Everyone, in fact, lost something. Much more was yet to be lost. But Egbert thought he had a secret weapon.
You are about to witness the introduction of America's most advanced automobile, the Avanti by Studebaker.
Egbert conceived it. Raymond Loewy designed it. The body was fiberglass, not metal. The engine, hot. A Studebaker standard block, supercharged.
Add a Paxton supercharger if you wish.
Advisors told Egbert it would take at least 2 years to market the Avanti. He insisted it be ready in half that time, by the beginning of the '63 model year. Cliff McMillan would later shake his head and say it was an impossibility from the beginning. But I'll give him credit. He damn near made it.
During the 10-year period that
the usual amount of hype went with the car.
Bonneville Salt Flats.
Andy Granatelli of Indy 500 fame, he took one of them to the Bonneville Salt Flats and set 72 different land speed records.
Land speed record.
But there were big troubles at the plant in South Bend. They had years of experience bending metal. Fiberglass was something entirely different.
One thing about fiberglass is if it's once molded, it's set. It's in stone. You can't move it. With sheet metal, you can. If a door doesn't fit, you use big hammers and crowbars and so forth, and you get it adjusted. So the first bodies we had were not to specification.
Blame it on the bossa nova with its magic spell.
While President Egbert assured the stockholders that all was well with Avanti, they were going nuts in the plant. Nothing fit. McMillan remembers a story about it, about a dealer in Texas.
He had prepared what he called an Avanti room, and it was all carpeted in red, and it had a red carpet running out to the pavement, and it had red footprints painted on the pavement from each direction, and he was just waiting for his Avanti. And come announcement date, he didn't have one. He called me up and raised hell. He wasn't alone. There were most of the 2,000 people didn't have Avantis.
So there were no Avantis, and the Lark was failing. Only this car, the Hawk, was selling, but it couldn't carry the company. The board met in New York, and on December 9th, 1963, Studebaker went out of the automobile business in South Bend. The last Studebakers were loaded on trucks in the back of the plant, and that was it. Oh, there was a year or two of making token cars in Canada, but it was all over. Over for everyone, especially the workers.
Over the top. On the peg.
Remember the family of craftsmen, the Bocons? Remember the film Studebaker made about them and its message about how the company believed in its workers and the old motto, always give more than you promised? Well, 30 years after the film and 20 years after the shutdown, we got the Bocons back together again.
When are we going to go eat, Selma? I got 0. Huh?
In that 1952 film, there had been a birthday celebration for Pop Bocon. They gathered around the family table, and the scene was one of warmth and love.
Individually, for all the graces.
This year, they sat at that same table and made the same dinner. Mom and Pop Bocon are no longer with them, but they are remembered, and the room is still filled with love.
All right, pass the grub.
Where's that big grocery Papa had? Remember what this reminds me of? When Mother used to make the big meals when we had the thrashers come.
Rudy Bocon is retired now. In the old Studebaker film, he was shown in the backyard raising minks, remember? Today, he collects beer cans, thousands of them. It's ironic. Lots of those labels are from companies that are gone, just like Studebaker. But to Rudy, it will always be the best job of his life.
I enjoyed going through that gate and going to work. It was a glamorous place to work.
Velma Bokan Sikorsky. In 1952, she had left Studebaker to raise a family.
I worked other places, and I don't have that bond with the other places like I do at Studebaker's.
It's amazing, the plant closing down and taking away their security, but the Bokans still being loyal. They always were. There was a myth that the Studebaker workers did not support the product, but that was not true.
Don't make them like they used to, that's all. Sure. Too much Japanese junk in them.
In the 1952 family of craftsmen, the Bokans were shown on their way to church, driving 5 Studebakers. They all owned them. The Bokans were typical of most of the workers at Studebaker. 95% of the employees at that company drove the company cars. The past does bring up some regrets, deep ones. How did Pop Bokan feel, the man who wanted his family to be brought together forever on the farmland that he bought with his paycheck?
For years, he always said, Studebaker's broke up my family because we all lived here all together. And he said, Studebaker's broke up my family.
4 of the children were forced to move away. That was true for Lillian and Joe, the newlyweds in that film.
You know, when the work shuts down, you pursue where you can, and the younger people naturally moved out.
For Irene, it is especially hard now.
Dad, like I said before, we're all separated now. In old age, we're not together. Before, we was always together. Easter, Christmas, birthdays, Thanksgiving. It's just beautiful to just sit down at that table all together.
Rudy, please realize that 30 years ago,
Although most memories are good, there are things that bother the Bokans. Everyone at this table lost something, their retirement. In 1963, the pension plan wasn't vested. When Studebaker pulled the plug, most of the workers lost a big chunk of their future, another promise that Studebaker didn't keep. Irene's husband, Al, was one of many who had to start all over again.
That's the only thing that gets me. You know, I had 20-some years there. I would have been retired now. But I started all over again after that.
In South Bend, some of the older workers feel they were had. It appears they were. From board minutes recently made public, we know that the directors discussed the possibility that if they continued making cars and trucks in South Bend, they would have to put millions of dollars into the pension fund. Obviously, if they did not, the money could be used in other corporate divisions. But employees like Rudy Bokan never knew that. They weren't invited to those board meetings, of course, and the records have been kept secret for 20 years. So to this day, there are still those who have unquestioning loyalty.
That was my life. That was my life. I even told the foreman, I says, sir, I'll work for you till the day I die. You know, I said, I'll be here till I die, till they take me out of here or either retire.
It just breaks your heart to think everybody just fell apart, you know.
You know, a lot of them went into maybe do a little carpenter work or repair a lawnmower, just wherever they could pick up a little money.
Look, I work for Salvation Army, right? There's 3 guys in there, Studebaker employees. They all turned alcoholics. They said they was too old to get jobs. It makes you sick.
What Evelyn says is true. Most of the workers were older. The plant was all some of them had ever known. Many had no other skills whatever. Soon there were reports of broken families, even suicides. Some of the workers were so down, they stayed in their homes, too depressed to even go out to collect their unemployment checks. Even Rudy Bokan gave up for a while. He felt all washed up at 46. It took his wife to shake him out of it.
Well, he was very depressed, you know. He said he's too old. So I just went down to the employment office and talked to Mrs. Battles and Mrs. Wolf, and they said, Evelyn, there's 2 openings at South Bend Lathe, and I'll give you a card, and you tell Reed to get over there tomorrow. So the next day I took him there, and he's been there ever since.
Even now, it is painful for the survivors to look back at the years surrounding the close of Studebaker. Just ask Evelyn Bokan, what was the happiest time of her life?
When everybody was working at Studies, and the kids was little, grown up, you know, mother and father was what?
gonna go now.
It's different now. The family gatherings have become reunions. The cars in the driveway are no longer Studebakers, and South Bend is no longer an automotive town.
Okay, yeah, give me the camera. Boy. Okay, pick up. Irene, fight.
Why did Studebaker close? We'll find out after this message.
If you're thinking about buying a new car, check the many exclusive features of tomorrow. Yours from the advanced thinking of Studebaker.
Ray Barnett teaches business at the University of Indiana in South Bend, but in the late 50s and 60s, he headed Studebaker's advertising department. He says the company began to care more about its other divisions, and at the same time, he had only 10% of what GM and Ford had for advertising.
Studebaker deserved an opportunity to survive. It's just one of those situations where, in my opinion, the financial people in New York said, well, the rest of the divisions are making money, the automotive division is losing money, let's pull the cord. It was that simple.
But was it that simple? Former VP of Local Number 5, Lester Fox.
I think they lost the will to manage, to make the hard decisions, to fulfill the responsibility to the stockholders, to the employees, to the dealers, to everybody, and opted to take the easy road once too often.
The easy road? Could that have applied to Fox's own Local Number 5 as well? Lots of people in South Bend think it did.
Then there's times when it was also the labor's fault, too. You know, it's a lot of fellas thought, well, hey, I'm getting older now. I don't have to work now. I let the younger ones work, you know.
There are those who can argue that the union was too strong. Many times, my own belief is that a union is about as strong as the management is weak.
Weak management, labor problems, all part of the mix. So, to some extent, was quality. At one time, Studebaker built its reputation on quality. Oh, the engines were still pretty good, but now there were charges of leaks and rust problems in the body, up by the front fenders near the door. If quality slipped, so did another important factor, something that had always been part of the Studebaker tradition, and that is design.
They began laying off engineers, and these are the people, in my opinion, that should have been kept.
If they would have modernized it a little more, I would say that they would have, I think we'd still be surviving today. You know.
Another problem, competition got tougher. Former Studebaker exec Cliff McMillan.
Big Three didn't want Studebaker to go out of business, but on the same hand, they didn't want us to make any money.
And there is no way to keep on if you're not making money. When Lauren Pennington, the Studebaker expert, comes back to South Bend and sifts through the wreckage that now surrounds that plant, he comes up with still another reason for the company's demise. The reason that he believes is the central one.
Where General Motors and Chrysler and Ford beat them was out there selling cars in the dealer organizations. They had the dealer organizations and Studebaker didn't.
The major dealership in South Bend was directly across the street from the factory. In its time, it was a strong, viable business run by very aggressive salesmen, and that stands to reason. The hometown store would be good. But out in the hinterlands, apparently, it was different.
Most valuable franchise is the Chevrolet franchise, then the Ford franchise, then your Oldsmobile franchise. And by the time you get down to the Studebaker, in a town like Emporia, you have a very marginal dealer who is not well financed. He's not the best dealer in town. Because he's the best dealer, he wouldn't be a Studebaker dealer.
Company leaders were aware of that problem, but what did they do about it? They didn't pour money into advertising, that's for sure. Instead, they made another big PR production for dealers.
Starting the business from the ground up, Mr. Norton?
Hi, Susan. How'd you know it was me?
I'd know those size 12s anyway.
This is a story about a father who wants to make his son a partner in the family business, the business of selling Studebakers.
Well, I'm just not sure that selling cars is really what I want to do.
There's a lot more to it than just selling cars, Hal. The name of Norton means something to the people of this town. It stands for honest service, for a pride in our product.
The son is obviously a bright, aggressive, and handsome chap, but he's still not sure the job's for him. So Dad sends him to South Bend to see how the Studebakers are made.
And as usual,
I was looking up at the underside of a Studebaker.
Naturally, once the son sees Studebaker's quality, he comes home full of enthusiasm and new ideas for selling. He can hardly wait to become the new partner. And the film ends in a grand Hollywood flourish.
Oh, look. It's beautiful, Mr. Norton.
It certainly is.
Studebaker thought it needed films like this. The dealers were still ordering cars from the factory just one by one, while the big three were selling from large inventories on the floor, supermarket style.
The reputation of Studebaker dealers was that Studebaker dealers wouldn't deal. And this comes up all through the period after World War II, and I presume may have applied before then, too. That is, that a Studebaker dealer would rather sell 5 cars at a profit of $500 each than he would to sell 25 cars at $100 each.
Try to see it my way. Do I have to?
That view may be accurate, all right, but it's certainly not shared here on Chicago's southwest side. Toyota on Western used to be called Studebaker on Western until 1964. Homer Martz, the man on the right there, he was a partner in it since 1948. He's 80 years old now, has sold an awful lot of cars. Bill Brennan was his sales manager, and they both think that blaming the dealers is a lot of bunk.
They had some good dealers, and I'm like Bill. I think it's just a lack of advertising, and they never did advertise to speak of. And
where GM and Ford and them would take $20 million and put it in advertisement and take a 5-gallon can and put wheels on it and put the name GM on there, and it would sell.
But even without a lot of advertising, they were able to sell cars here on Western Avenue right up to the bitter end.
It was about 5 o'clock in the evening. And I was delivering a card to a woman. I had all the papers on the desk and having her sign them up, and I had a little radio there. And on the radio it says, as of 5 o'clock tonight, Studebaker discontinues making automobiles in the United States. The woman looked at me and she said, what am I going to do with the car? I says, that's just propaganda. Wait till we find out more. So finally she signed the papers and I delivered the car. After we got her out of the building, we turned on all the radios and calling everybody and trying to find out what happened. Sure enough, it was true.
The report that surprised Bill Brennan was not news here, not at the South Bend Tribune, the paper that angered Studebaker management by leaking the story. Managing editor Jack Powers.
When it came, yes, we broke it. And we broke it before the PR people had decreed it should be broken. Now, what people wanted to do in those interim few weeks, we can only guess. I've guessed for years.
What do you think?
I think perhaps people wanted to do some stock bailout and things like that, and we messed them up.
For years, the Tribune had been warning the people that this could happen.
When the end finally came, no one in the community was really shocked. Or perhaps it's like death. When it did come, people were still shocked. They should not have been.
The community rallied, held public meetings, and was particularly moved by the words of one businessman, Paul Gilbert.
Studebaker, and this is not Studebaker, Indiana. This is South Bend, Indiana. And
the townspeople pulled together. It was the early 60s and times were good, and they were able to woo other small businesses.
Out of the Studebaker closing, the tragedy, if you will, I think came an awareness that the community had to diversify economically. Its industrial base had to be diversified. It was a good lesson for everybody. I'm not sure everybody learned the lesson, but it was there.
South Bend, that's for sure. The population hasn't grown. In fact, they've lost a few people since Studebaker closed.
Yesterday.
And the town suffers from some of the same kinds of economic problems found in other parts of the Midwest. But South Bend has survived. And in many ways, it has done it creatively.
Dressed in a simple gown, to me were as lovely as a queen.
Remember those older workers, the ones who lost their pensions and had trouble finding jobs? And remember how citizens in South Bend pulled together to find solutions? Well, here's one of the results of all that. A summer picnic for older people, sponsored by a community program called Real Services. With a budget of $6 million a year, it provides food, assistance, and support for the elderly. And the man in charge? Former Union VP Les Fox. He resigned that position to devote his time to helping his fellow workers.
The older workers, at least those that I've had experience with, are proud They work hard to maintain their independence. When they have a need to ask for assistance, it is a genuine need.
It's not easy to run a giant social service agency, money to be handled, contracts to be negotiated. So when Les Fox needed help, he turned to the most skillful management person he knew, his old adversary from Studebaker, Cliff McMillan. Fox says that when you need to get a job done, you hire the best person you can.
And at any one time, we may have in excess of $100,000. It was extremely helpful.
The old wounds heal. South Bend now celebrates its
So
past.
with that, we'll begin our festivities.
Summer 1983, a special new museum is opened dedicated to the memory of Studebaker.
I think if Paul Gilbert were here today, he'd be the first one to stand up and say, we survived this South Bend, Indiana, and again, we are Studebaker, Indiana. 20 years ago...
The lessons aren't new to the listener anymore because communities across the top of the nation have learned them. Okay, we learned that lesson 20 years ago, and some of our countrymen are learning it now.
We'll conclude after this message.
I think this demonstrates pretty accurately all the room you get in the Lark. 6 Husky astronaut trainees like these seated in comfort.
This is what a modern automobile factory looks like today. Much of the work is being done by machines, less and less done by people. People who will never return to these jobs. Labor costs are down. Why? Part of it started here. You heard people say that the union raped Studebaker. Workers didn't work. Wages were too high. You also heard there were some quality problems, that the plant aged. The company did nothing to retool or remodel, that it took too many men to build just one car. And some of that's true. But you also heard that if the dealers didn't sell the cars, nothing else mattered. You heard that the Studebaker management was poor. They didn't keep up with advertising or marketing or much else. And perhaps that's true as well. All those chickens later came home to roost in America's automobile business. It was as if the big three learned absolutely nothing from Studebaker's mistakes. Nor did they seem to learn very much from Studebaker's successes. Studebaker was very successful, for example, in its design, like in 1958 and 59, when it developed a popular quality compact car. Americans were ready for it and bought it until the big three came out with their own compacts and beat Studebaker at its own game. But then, surprise, the American compacts got bigger and bigger and bigger, leaving the small car field wide open for the Japanese automakers. The Japanese also encouraged company pride and togetherness. They knew that at Studebaker once upon a time, but somewhere in American business in general, the pride got lost. Coupled with the energy crisis, the complacency of our auto industry led to gigantic losses to foreign competitors. In Chicago alone, steel mills that turned out metal for American cars, they've closed down or cut way back. And just recently, Chrysler shut down its Belvedere plant in northern Illinois. Perhaps the next chapter will be better. Perhaps. There seems to be a recovery, but many workers will never return to the auto industry, like the Bocons. Yet they have survived, just as they survived the insecurity and the poverty of immigration, just as they survived the Great Depression and the death of the company that championed them as the symbol of its product. Studebaker gave the Bocons less than it promised, but the Bocons did not give up. They all have other jobs, all have nice homes, and by most anyone's standards, they are affluent. And in those ways, they are still a symbol. But larger and more important than Studebaker, they are a symbol of the American spirit, and we can be proud of that.
We thank you, Lord, for bringing us all together to family. We thank you collectively, individually, for all the graces bestowed upon us. I can't stop loving you. I've made up my mind to live in memory of the lonesome time.
If you would like a VHS copy of the program you just saw, send $24.95 to